The one institution that was never supposed to blink is now whispering that the supreme leader must go. That is the moment this story begins. Not with the crowds in Tehran, not with the shortages, not with the blackouts, not even with the latest rumor about where Mojtaba Khamenei is hiding. With that, because once the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps starts circulating the idea that the supreme leader should resign, the crisis inside Iran is no longer a normal protest wave or even a normal succession struggle. It becomes something deeper and much more dangerous. It becomes a rupture between the regime and the men who were built to protect the regime from rupture. And the real story is not that Iran is under pressure. The real story is that the guardians of the system may no longer believe in the story that justified the system. That is what makes this moment so volatile. For 47 years, the Islamic Republic endured things that would have destroyed many other states: war, sanctions, assassinations, proxy conflicts, internal unrest, diplomatic isolation, long economic pain. It survived because it did not rely only on prosperity, and it did not rely only on repression. It survived because it built a psychological contract with its own base. We do not bow. We do not trade dignity for relief. We suffer, but we do not surrender. Resistance is not merely what we do. Resistance is what proves we deserve to rule. That was the covenant. The source text you gave me is really about the collapse of that covenant. Most people will read this as a protest story. That is too shallow. The street matters, yes. The economy matters, yes. But those are downstream effects. The first break happened at the level of meaning. It happened when the regime appeared to surrender its last serious leverage point without visibly getting anything back. That is why the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz matters so much in this piece. To an outsider, it may look like a tactical shipping decision. To the regime's own loyalists, it looked like something much bigger. The quiet surrender of the last clean pressure card Iran still held against the outside world. As long as the strait stayed in play, the regime could still tell people that hardship was buying influence. Oil prices moved when Iran moved. Global shipping cared when Tehran tightened or loosened its grip. The world still had to reckon with Iran. Then the strait was reopened, no clear deal, no visible concession in return, no triumphant explanation from the apex, no public narrative capable of turning retreat into strategy. That is why the reaction was not disappointment, it was rage. Because the reopening of the strait told every audience inside Iran a different but equally devastating thing. It told the Guard that leverage had been given away. It told hardliners that the language of resistance had become empty theater. It told ordinary Iranians that years of sanctions and sacrifice had not accumulated into strength. And it told the regime's own base that the state might not even know how to preserve dignity anymore. That is where the fracture began. And once the covenant broke, 3 wars inside the regime started burning at the same time. The first war is between the civilian shell and the military core. The source text is explicit on this point. Iran still has a president. It still has ministries. It still has the formal language of constitutional government. But the center of decision has drifted elsewhere. Pezeshkian does not appear to control the line of the state. He can be contradicted, cornered, and functionally reduced. The republic still carries the look of a state with civilian institutions, but the actual power has moved toward a 3-man structure of guard origin, Vahidi, Zolgadar, Mohsen, Rezeh. That matters because it tells you this is no longer just factional politics inside a hard regime. It is the emergence of military rule without the honesty to call itself military rule. The civilian apparatus still signs, it still speaks. It still exists, but it no longer decides. The second war is between the Guard and the clergy. This one may be even more explosive because it cuts into the regime's theological foundation. The Islamic Republic was not supposed to be a security state wearing clerical language. It was supposed to be clerical authority fused with state power. The supreme jurist at the top, theocracy is legitimacy, not merely decoration. But what happens when the supreme leader is invisible? The president is marginal. And the real operating center is a military security committee. The answer is brutal. The theocracy begins to look like a wrapper around a state whose real sovereign is the coercive apparatus. That is why the source's description of the clergy's anxiety is so important. The mullahs are not only watching influence slip away, they are watching the reason for their rule become harder to defend. If the state can continue under guard management while the clerical apex is absent, then the old claim that sacred authority sits at the center of power starts to look false. That is not an ordinary institutional problem. That is a legitimacy implosion. The third war is in society itself. This is the layer most people will reduce to economics, and that would be a mistake. Yes, the economic pain is severe. Power cuts can last 12 hours. Fuel queues stretch for kilometers. Medicine is scarce. Food costs have surged. Businesses are closing. Cash machines are running empty. The so-called resistance economy has been exposed as a slogan financed partly by inflationary extraction from the public. But the reason that pain is now explosive is not simply that it exists. It is that it no longer feels meaningful. For years, the state taught people to interpret suffering as proof of patriotic and religious seriousness. You endure now because the regime is preserving your dignity later. You sacrifice today because the country is standing upright under pressure. That logic only works if the regime can still point to visible acts of resistance that produce visible leverage. Once Hormuz was reopened without visible gain, the story underneath the suffering began to die. That is why the chants for the Shah matter so much. In this source, they are not just anti-government chants. They are anti-origin chants. The Islamic Republic exists because the monarchy was overthrown. If people are now invoking the return of the Shah, the regime is not merely being criticized. Its founding myth is being reversed in public. That is what happens when the story collapses before the state collapses. And then there's Mojaba. Here, the source text becomes even more dangerous. For 35 days, there was no real public embodiment of supreme leadership, no stabilizing image, no speech, no command performance. That could convince the nation that the apex remained firm. While the lower levels were shaking, it is possible he is injured. It is possible the absence is partly security driven. But politically, the exact reason matters less than the effect. The effect is vacancy, and vacancy at the top is poison in a system like this. Because hard regimes do not always need loved rulers, but they do need visible rulers. They need someone who can absorb contradictions and impose a single line downward. Once the top goes silent, every lower institution starts improvising. The president hedges, the clergy worries, the public radicalizes, the guard starts recalculating. That is when the whispers become lethal. If senior IRGC figures are now really circulating the position that the supreme leader should go, then the question inside the regime has changed from how do we suppress this to can the system survive with this man still at the top? That is a different level of crisis, because once the coercive core begins to ask that question, time starts working against the ruler. Very quickly, the men with guns do not need to launch a public coup for the damage to begin. They only need to stop believing that the throne above them is the best instrument for preserving the system they themselves are trying to preserve. That is where the story becomes more than a protest story and more than a succession story. It becomes a Guardian fracture story. And Guardian fractures are historically deadly. The reason is simple. Public anger is expected. Hardship is survivable. Foreign enemies can even help unify a regime. But when the institution responsible for enforcing obedience begins quietly doubting the political symbol it is supposed to defend, the entire architecture of fear becomes unstable. The commander wonders whether the chain above him still matters. The officer wonders whether the order is still sacred. The apparatchik wonders whether tomorrow belongs to a different center of power than the one he publicly serves today. That is how regimes hollow out before they visibly fall. The source adds one more layer that makes this even worse. Paranoia inside the guard, March targeting operations reached figures who thought they were protected. Communication is being restricted. Suspicion of leaks is spreading. That matters because the guard is not just the regime's sword. It is also its nervous system. If the nervous system begins distrusting its own signals while simultaneously doubting the apex, the system does not need one final blow to become dangerous to itself. That is the real fear in this piece. Not that Iran will simply explode tomorrow. Not that the crowds alone will topple the state. Not that one speech or one resignation instantly ends the republic. The real fear is that belief is withdrawing from all the wrong places at the same time. The public no longer believes the pain buys dignity. The clergy no longer fully believes the sacred center still governs. The civilians no longer visibly govern at all. And the guard may no longer believe the man at the top can keep the whole structure from breaking. That is not one problem. That is system-wide narrative death. A regime can survive sanctions. It can survive shortages. It can survive war. It can survive humiliation. What it struggles to survive is the moment when the people who justify it, the people who endure for it, and the people who repress for it all begin to doubt the same central story. That is, the threshold Iran now seems to be approaching. And once a revolutionary regime reaches that threshold, the shell can still stand for a while. The flags still wave. The rallies still happen. The television still broadcasts. The arrests still continue. The institutions remain visible. But the force that made those institutions feel permanent has started to leave belief. And once belief leaves the guardians of a regime, the collapse no longer waits for public permission. It becomes a question of which men with power move first and which men with power hesitate too long. That is why I would leave this story here. The Islamic Republic may not fall because the street became ungovernable. It may fall because the men who were built to save it have started wondering whether saving the man at the top is the same thing as saving the regime at all.